economy as such was in doldrum for last few years, and the change was required. People required a new leader to take it in the different direction from the where Indian economy was heading currently. This had the more expectations from the finance minister. Finance minister started his budget with the finance speech saying that they couldn't do much more things because they were only 45 days in the power. During budget speech, in 45 days, they have announced a 2800 crore schemes. So whether this creates in our mind whether this budget is the election budget, the state elections which are due in next 6 months in various parts of country. So whether this is announcements for the elections or something else. As such, Indian economy is said that survives morely because we are a saving-based economy as compared to the Western countries. Individual saving, household savings are much higher. For last couple of years or last few years, we see that the savings rate have reduced from around 34% to less than 30% to GDP. No doubt, GDP also reduced, is half from around 9% to 4.5%. So this creates the lowest savings, and since the lowest savings are lower, the growth in economy has been hampered. But whether the finance bill or budget has done something to increase the savings, this finance minister himself accepted that savings need to be done, but whether he has really done or still this budget has been terrorized by babus. The word used was tax terrorism. Still these babus are the tax terrorists or not till them. Because we find many such signals. The budget, though it is being given now by the new government, but the thought process which was there by previous government still continues. The things which they never liked earlier has been tried to change in this finance bill. For example, the 54 EC which is there, where the investment was earlier unlimited, you can do whoever sells the assets, you can make unlimited investment. Then it was issued 50 lakhs. Courts interpreted that though 50 lakhs is that because of avoiding, you can have in 2 financial years, so that makes 1 crore. And this was never accepted by the department. And the changes have came in this finance bill. When on the one side the finance minister is saying that we want the savings to encourage, then why this saving was not encouraged? Because if they are increasing the PPF limit, the cost to the government is around 9%, and these funds which are there directly goes to the infrastructure development, and the other cost is 5%, because the PPF money which is coming to the center, it is going to state government for the payment of interest, will not be going for development, but the money which comes in this 54EC bonds directly goes to the infrastructure development of the country. Even this time we find the unique feature in the finance bill that finance ministry, we found that finance minister burdened with other ministries also, and the health was deteriorated. He couldn't complete his speech standing, he was sitting. So this was seen from his, for the first time any finance minister gave his speech while sitting. So this also has that since his health was deteriorated at that point of time maybe, and many things which they have in their mind probably not came in the budget, it may come in the years to come. Because if we say the Modi trend in the Gujarat, usually the things don't come through the budget or it was not through the announcements. It was taken care subsequently, so the hope is not been lost. With just 45 days we can't judge any government. But certain trends which were expected are not being seen, but hopefully by the work we may see in the coming days, some new things may come there. The one positive sign from the finance bill was that they want to try to reduce litigation. Attempt has been made to reduce the litigation, but still the things which was required has not been done, and many announcements were found in his speech but not in the finance bill. So we have to see what will come in the subsequently, more in the finance bill or subsequently taxation amendment act or something is there in place, we don't know. but these changes are there. Hope we have something good things to come in coming days, and we again come together for discussion on the taxation amendment bill or something like that in days to come. With these few words, I again welcome you to this analysis of the finance bill number 2 of 2014, and I request Shardul Shah to say a few words, Regional Council Member of WRC.
Respected Chairman of the session, respected President of CTC, members of the dais, seniors and friends, a very good afternoon to each one of you. I know it's very difficult on a Saturday, rainy season outside, and all of you all are present here, at least in good number. Does show that there's some appetite yet left to listen to budget talks. But I can say, friends, that there is a world outside, a lot of hill stations outside, a lot of trekking. One must enjoy life as well. May things as it may be, but I'm really happy that Chamber and WRC has been organizing this budget joint lecture meetings for a long time, and I really thank the Chamber, President Paras, and all the young office bearers for initiating this. And I can assure you, friends, that in times to come, Chamber and Institute will also continue to have much more and exhaustive joint programs in the near future as well. The only objective of all these organizations is to disseminate knowledge, and I think knowledge is the only important factor for all the organizations. So thank you once again, Chamber, for having this, and in times to come we'll have more. Friends, as far as this budget meeting is concerned, I can only say, as far as the budget is concerned, that I personally feel is a very positive budget. It's a good budget. For 10 long years or for maybe longer time, one particular set of people were ruling the country, and you suddenly see that they can't even have a leader of opposition. So definitely in times to come, you're going to have good times, and I think the roadmap is very positive. The FM or even the new PM, I think they have a great team. And I think let us give us some time to the government, let us be patient, and I think all of us have learned patience during our CA course, and you will see the results. So I think let us give patience to this entire new government, and I think a lot of new initiatives will come. You see, for example, new initiatives taken by the government as far as FDI is concerned. Even, for example, if you see the changes which they have been forced upon through the RBI and through various government initiatives, we will see times to come. Friends, as far as fraternity is concerned, I am very happy to learn from one of our colleagues that they have recently converted into LLPs. So I once again request our fellow chartered accountants and also members who are lawyers that it is a good time for you to explore the possibility of converting your organization into an LLP. There is a lot of talks and about M&A as far as the corporate world is concerned, friends. So if you see the kind of activity which is just started, or probably if you see the shoots of the merger acquisition and the kind of deals, I request all of you, friends, that to slowly get involved also in terms of any kind of organizational change or any kind of activity as far as deals are concerned. I think chartered accountants and lawyers play a very important role, and I think slowly and steadily we'll see a lot of transaction services where we should get ourselves. Lastly, friends, the new Companies Act 2013, I'm sure we are definitely keeping ourselves abreast, but I'm sure Chamber as well, the Institute is taking initiatives. We all should read the law carefully and keep ourselves updated of the various changes, and if at all you have any representations through the Chamber or the Institute, probably we can take it up to the Ministry. But definitely this new Companies Act 2013 has posed a lot of changes and question marks, and we should at least try to keep ourselves updated with the same. With these words, friends, once again, thanks so much for giving me this opportunity. May I request Ketan Bhai, who is the Chairman of the Direct Tax Committee, to take the proceedings further. Thank you.
Respected Chairman of today's session, Keshav Bhai Bhujle, the speakers, Gautam Bhai, Chetan Bhai, President Paras, Shardul, Preeti, Avinash, seniors and friends. My task for the day is to introduce the chairman of today's session and also the speaker of this session, Shri Keshav Bhujle and Shri Gautam Bhai. Coming to the introduction of Shri Keshav Bhujle, Shri Budle sir is an MSc LLM, registered as the member of the Bar Council in the year 1980, and thereafter he was with the chamber of Shri V.H. Patil. Well, we all know Budle sir quite in detail, but just to...
No, you should have a practice of brief introduction.
Yes, sir. So this is only to encourage the new entrants to the profession. So he is a regular contributor to the column in the High Courts, which we are all reading in the BCA journal, and he has also delivered lectures at various seminars and conferences. He has been the chairman of All India Federation of Tax Practitioners, Western Zone, for the year 2006 and 7. He has been member of the editorial board of the journal of our chamber, that is Income Tax Review, and he has been the member of the Direct Tax Committee of IMC and also the president of the Chamber of Tax Consultants for the 94-96, and he has been editor of the journal for the year 2003-2006. With this very brief introduction, sir, I would request all of you to welcome Shri Keshav Budle. Before I go to the introduction of Shri Gautam Nayak, may I request Paras Bhai to welcome Budle sir with a memento. Our first technical speaker for the day, C.A. Gautam Nayak, is a chartered accountant, is a partner of C&K and Associates LLP. He is a rank holder in both intermediate and final CA examinations of the institute, and he has been the president of the BCA Society for the year 2004-05, and he has been the editor and joint editor of the Journal of BCA for 2005 to 2010. Currently, he is the chairman of the International Taxation Committee of the Bombay Chartered Accountant Society, and he has been the chairman of the Bombay Chartered Accountant Society's Tax Committee, Direct Tax Committee for the year 2011 to 2014. He has co-authored many books, including Transactions in Shares and Securities, Taxation of Charitable Trust, which are published by BCA Society, and he has also revised the ICI publication on Taxation of Charitable Trust. He has also been speaking at various forums, at various seminars and conferences, RRCs of Chamber, BCA, and various other such bodies on various topics of direct tax. Besides having contributed to all these professional journals, he writes a fortnightly column on personal taxation for the financial newspaper Mint for the last 3 years. He has also contributed article on taxation to other newspapers and publications such as Economic Times, Outlook, Money Outlook, Outlook Open, etc. And one more best part about Gautam Bhai as well as Keshav Budle sir is that whenever we have requested them to be part of any of the program of the chamber, they have always been with us. They never said no. This time also when I approached both of them, I was immediately said yes, and we are really thankful to you, sir, for this nice gesture for years and years. Thank you very much. I would request C.A. Preeti Savla, the regional council member, to please offer a memento to Shri Gautam Bhai. I would request our chairman, Shri Keshav sir, to please give his opening remarks.
Hello. 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 Good afternoon, friends. This seminar on Finance Bill 2014 on direct taxes. I think today is the day for Chamber and WIRC for the budget and the Finance Bill. It is our regular practice for every year we have this program. The first part of this program is to understand the amendments which have come, and we have Gautam Nayak for explaining to us what are the amendments. Secondly, as we have seen this year, the amendments, one may say, quite simple, and that is the reason the response for such programs is not so much. Second part is only after you know what are the amendments, you will be able to make out whether it is really simple or not. In the third one, even if it is a simple one, the consequences of such amendment, when you try to understand, you learn a lot. And for that purpose, the first part, that is to understand what the amendments are, we have Gautam Naik, the right person to explain to us. And after we understand from him what are the amendments, there is some word which has been used in the past by all of us, and now our finance minister also, and that is what is called as terrorism or tax terrorism. And that we have a right person to explain what is terrorism or tax terrorism is the Chetan Karya. And after that, something if it is left out, I may have to speak something. Well, we have sections, we have a finance minister saying one concept, that is tax terrorism, in the sense bringing of a liability by way of a retrospective amendment many a times to overrule the Supreme Court judgments, something which is not unexpected. Now that is a good concept, and from that point of view, if you consider most of these amendments are prospective in nature, most of them very clearly specifically stated to be applicable from the assessment year 15-16. And to that extent, we will consider that the finance minister is interested in reducing the tax terrorism. Now still, the concept, though wherever it has been mentioned, that it will be from 15-16, our courts are trying to find out whether it is really prospective or not. This aspect also we have to consider, and if after understanding what the propositions are or the proposals are for the amendments are, with the explanation from Gautam, and after hearing Chetan Karya about those impacts of tax terrorism and consequences with this type of amendments, whatever left out, some issues I will also consider. I think to begin with, we have to understand these provisions, and I request Gautam Naik to explain to us all these provisions which have come by way of amendment. Gautam, please.
Chairman of the session, Keshav Bhujle, President of the Chamber, Paras, Shardul, Preeti, Ketan, and dear friends. I think one of the things which everybody was looking forward to was this budget. There was a lot of high expectations from this budget. Everybody said, "Achhe din aane wale hai," but so therefore that was one of the backdrop behind this budget. Now, there have been a lot of announcements made by the finance minister, etc. But if it looks really at the finance bill, sometimes a lot of people felt disappointed. In fact, Mr. Chidambaram went to say that this is just like a UPA budget. There's no difference. And frankly, I think if one looks at the whole finance bill, one realizes that there are certain things which the finance minister has referred to in his speech, which are not incorporated in the finance bill, like the increasing the number of benches of the AR, increasing the scope of the settlement commission, strengthening the settlement commission, etc. Those are a few, and having advance rulings for domestic taxpayers. Those don't find a place. So that actually, one gets the feeling that this was really a finance bill which was drafted by the Revenue Secretary. The finance minister really did not have too much time to incorporate what he wanted to do in this particular finance bill, and that's the outcome which one sees, and therefore he has just mentioned to it, referred to it in his speech, in the finance minister's speech, and that's the feeling which one gets when one looks at this budget. Because really, frankly speaking, if you ask me, a period of 45 days for somebody, for a lawyer who is not a tax lawyer, to understand the implications, to understand what the implications of the changes which are being recommended are, I think it's something which is extremely difficult. But a couple of points on this particular, when one looks at the finance bill, and for the first time, as Keshav mentioned, that we don't have too many retrospective amendments, in a sense that they're not applicable from SS India 14, 15 or earlier periods. But also at the same time, it is, normally you have a situation where there's been some litigation, to put an end to the litigation, they'll say, for the removal of doubt, it is clarified that. Now this time one does not find that. I think this is the Vodafone effect, possibly, because of the hue and cry which was raised about the Vodafone amendment. I think this time that is one thing which one finds. The second difference, I think, is that in the explanatory memorandum, for the first time one finds various types of examples being given to explain certain concepts which have been introduced, and that I think is a welcome thing. It explains what is the CBDT's understanding of the government's understanding of the position there. The amendments so far, I think, have been a mixed bag. I think there are quite a few amendments which try to settle controversies, but obviously in favor of the government. There are a few amendments, but very few, which give certain benefit to taxpayers. The significant, of course, is in relation to the tax rates. Obviously, I mean, that's something. And that is something which I suppose the finance minister must have pushed for. I think that's considering the BJP manifesto. Now let's look at what the finance bill has, and what in the finance minister's speech, one of the aspects, I think, about DTC, there was a lot of talk when DTC will come, what is whether it will, because the outgoing government had put the revised draft on the website after taking into account the observations of various stakeholders. So people were left wondering when will DTC come in its present form. There, the finance minister has gone to say that we would consider the comments received from stakeholders on the revised code, and we will review the interesting part is, he says, we will review DTC in its present shape and take a view in the whole matter. So it seems that the finance minister seems to be open to dropping DTC, because frankly speaking, I think today the way DTC is, it will only increase litigation, because most of the bad parts of DTC, such as GAR, such as various things have come into the present income tax law. So bringing in DTC will only destroy all judicial precedents, because then the language of the law will be different. So therefore the department will say that no, none of this applies, and therefore you will have litigation all over again, which will go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and only then will it be settled. So I think in a sense it's good if DTC is shelved in that sense, because otherwise it would have led to more litigation. The stock markets, of course, seem to have taken note of the fact that GAR, which is supposed to come with effect from SS India 2016-17, there is no reference to GAR either in the finance bill or in the finance minister's speech. And of course, the question is that there is still time of 1 more year for the finance minister to take a view on GAR, whether it needs to be postponed or not, and that's something which we'll have to wait and see. Coming to now the amendments which one finds a place in the finance bill. The first is, of course, the slab rates of tax. The basic exemption is increased from 2 lakh to 2,50,000 for individuals. For senior citizens, it goes up from 2,50,000 to 3 lakh. Very senior citizens, there's no change. But the interesting point which we need to keep in mind is that last year we had a rebate under section 87A which was introduced, that where the income is up to 5 lakh rupees, a rebate is available of up to 100% of the tax, up to rupees 2,000 rupees. So that rebate still continues. So effectively you get this 2,50,000 plus you get a rebate if your income is less than 5 lakh rupees. So that's something which one needs to keep in mind. Now, this is a significant giveaway in the increase in slab rates to everybody. Almost all taxpayers will get at least this 5,000 rupees plus. So 5,150 rupees is the minimum which, all people who have income above taxable limit, most people will get that benefit. So therefore, the question is, there will be a significant shortfall in the tax collection, and how has it been made up? That's the question. And if one reads the explanatory memorandum, in fact, one sees that really one significant area where there has been an increase is in the case of this grossing of dividend and income distribution tax of mutual funds. Now, it seems very innocuous, just say that all you have to do is just gross it up, because the logic which is given by the finance minister is that earlier taxpayers were paying tax on the 100 rupees. Now, what is happening is what is distributed is, say, a smaller amount and the taxes being paid on that smaller amount, and therefore effectively what is happening is that the government is losing out on tax. Now he forgets, I think, unfortunately finance ministers seem to have bad memories when it comes to earlier amendments, and here particularly that when the dividend distribution tax was introduced, at that time a study was done and it was felt that 7.5% would be sufficient to cover the taxes which were being paid on dividends by individuals. That was regarded as sufficient. But that time they introduced a 9% rate. That 9% has gone up over a period of time to 15%, plus with education cess, surcharge, etc. It is now 16.995. It was 16.995. And now to say grossing up again, that's one. The question here which arises, do you gross up on the basis of education cess and surcharge? Or do you gross up on the basis of the basic rate first and then you add an education cess and surcharge, the surcharge and education cess? If one looks at the provisions of the finance bill, if you look at clause 2, subclause 4, I think it says that whatever is the dividend distribution tax which is determined under the provisions of the Act, to that a surcharge will be added. And as you know, education cess is an additional surcharge, so therefore education cess will be added to that. So which means that you first have to determine what is the amount of dividend distribution tax under the Act. Now the rate under the Act is 15%, so therefore what you will do is you gross it up at 15%. So if you are distributing 100 rupees dividend, then you gross it up at 15%, so which will work out to whatever the figure, 117, 118%. Then to that you add a 10%, the 17% what you get, to add that you add your dividend distribution, your surcharge and the education cess. So therefore it works out to 19.98% of the dividend distributed. So that's one thing which one needs to keep in mind. What happens is that even if you look at the explanatory memorandum, they've given an example, and which is also grossing up on the 15%. Of course, there they have not added the surcharge and education cess at a later point of time. Effectively what happens is, as I said, the rate of distribution works out to 19.98% of the dividend distributed. For income from mutual fund units, which is distributed to individuals or HUFs, it works out to 37.75%. So from 28% it goes up to 37%, which means almost 1/3 increase. But the real cream, the icing on the cake, I would say, is in respect of income distributed to companies by mutual funds, because there, as you know, the rate was 30%. So it was currently it was 33.99%. That goes up to 48.55%. So almost a 50% increase. So therefore, that's where the finance minister hopes to make up a significant part of his giveaways, and that's something which people have not really realized. I think this complicated calculation, etc., and getting into the litigation as to what is the whether I don't know whether the government will clarify whether the basis of grossing up, etc. So I'm sure some officers will say no, you should have grossed up at 16.995%, which works out to 20 point something. It works out to 0.5% more. But I think simply could not the government just have said that we're increasing the dividend distribution tax from 16.995% to 20%, including, that would have been much simpler, I think, rather than go through this entire rigmarole, or, but I think that would have given away the game that what is the real increase, and that's the reason why, so therefore, to some extent one finds that the old habits die hard, as they say, so this is something which, and as I said, this is probably bureaucrats trying to play a little smart there. The other interesting thing is that a significant chunk of dividends goes to the government from the public sector banks and public sector companies. I don't know whether they've done the math and worked out that this money will effectively reduce the dividend which is available to the government. So therefore, what they are getting on one hand, they're losing a significant part of that on the other hand. So that's something which one will have to wait and see what happens there. And the other thing is that the effective date is 1st October 2014. So therefore, any dividend which is declared by AGM prior to 30th September, up to 30th September 2014, will attract the old rates. The new rates will apply only if the declaration is after 1st October, if it's a final dividend. If it's an interim dividend, the date of distribution is the material date. So if you distribute the interim dividend before 30th September, then the old rates will apply. If it's distributed after 30th September, then the new rates will apply. That's something so far as the dividend and income distribution tax goes. The other change in the rates of taxes in relation to long-term capital gains. As you know, section 112 lays down the rate of long-term capital gains tax, and the rate is 20% is the general rate. You had a proviso to that which says that in respect of shares and in respect of equity-oriented, in respect of units of mutual funds, the rate will be either 10% of the capital gain computed without indexation of cost, or 20% computed with indexation of cost, whichever is lower. That will be the rate of tax. So therefore, you would do this parallel competition and work out which is the lower of the two. Now what they're saying is, this 10% rate would not be applicable to units. And what would be the impact of this? Now, equity-oriented fund units, no problem. In any case, long-term capital gains on equity-oriented fund units are exempt from tax because they are subject to STT. But all other mutual fund units, therefore, now the rate would be 20% plus indexation. So that's something which we need to keep in mind. In fact, even the new category of business trust, they said units of business trust, because units would include units of mutual funds as well as units of business trust. So that will also be subjected to 20% if it is not on the stock market. So that is something which now this, I think, we'll come to at a little later stage when we consider the amendment in relating to the period of holding short-term, long-term. So far as units are concerned, I think there has been a significant impact. And what is the government thinking in the matter? Let's look at that. The next series of amendments which I will deal with is in relation to charitable trusts. As you know, under section 1023C, you have various categories of charitable trusts have been giving specific exemption. You have 1023C, 3AB and 3AC, which deal with educational institutions and medical institutions, where they say that if they're wholly or substantially financed by the government, they are entitled to the benefit of exemption. All the other conditions, which are contained in all those 18 provisos, those don't apply there. So therefore, if you're wholly or substantially financed by the government, no problem, full exemption for the income. Earlier, so far we had this definition, what is the meaning of substantially financed, was not there. There has been quite a bit of litigation on this. One matter reached the Karnataka High Court in the case of Indian Institute of Management, where the Karnataka High Court said that 38% amounts to substantially financed, it's a substantial finance. And the Chennai Tribunal in case of Ganpati Educational Trust took a view that 47% is also substantially financed. And in Jat Education Society, Delhi Tribunal also took a view that 45% amounts to substantial finance. They said, department is trying to take the standard, no, it's 51%, 50% or more, which is then substantial finance. But I think the tribunals and courts have consistently taken a view that even something less than 50% would also be amount to substantial finance, in these cases. Now the amendment that is proposed is that if the government grant in a particular year exceeds the prescribed percentage of the total receipts, including the voluntary contributions, in the total receipts you include the voluntary contributions, then in that case it will qualify, it will amount to being substantially financed and will qualify for exemption. Now, which means that you will have something coming in the rules. Now, I don't know why they could not have very well just put it in the act instead of saying that we will prescribe a rule for that. The only reason I can think of is that for tax purposes, etc., they may want to change the level of substantially financed. Today, it may come at 30%. If they feel that, no, we are losing out on a lot of tax, it may go up to 50%. It may go up to 75%. Who knows? Depending on the tax exigencies. And that's something which I think is unfortunate. It would have been better if, what happens is, this is linked also to the income of the current year. Now, I will not know until the end of the year what is the extent of government grants and vis-a-vis my total income. So until the end of the year, I will not even know whether I'm exempt or not. So how do I pay advance tax, etc. And typically, if you look at most schools, etc., the problem which they have is that government grants never come in time, and you can't time it. 1 year you may not get any government grants at all. Next year you will get 2 years government grants. So second year you will be substantially financed, first year you will not be substantially financed. Now, this is something which I think is unfortunate. That is something which doesn't seem to have been taken care. Perhaps they should have said it's an average of 3 years, etc. Something like that would have been a much better thing to do. But that's something which unfortunately government does not necessarily think that way. One question is whether corpus donations have to be considered as part of total receipts for verifying this percentage. And I believe that corpus donations are capital receipts. They do not form part of the total receipts for the purpose of, because here what we are talking about total receipts is revenue receipts. So therefore, I would feel that even perhaps capital grant would also go out in that sense, because what you exclude from the numerator, you also got to, from the denominator, you also exclude from the numerator. Both ways it would work. But I think that's something which there is no clarity on that. But I think the better view is that corpus donations would not have to be considered for this purpose. The next amendment in relation to charitable trusts, it's an amendment which is made both under section 1023C in clauses 4, 5, 6 and 7. And it's also made in respect of section 11. Now, you know, the Bombay Tribunal in the case of Jamshedji Tata Trust took a view that the trust which is claiming exemption under section 11 is also entitled to claim exemption under section 1034 in respect of dividends earned by it. So the dividends would qualify for exemption even if it is claiming exemption under section 11 in respect of its income. That was the view which was taken. So therefore, and also what was happening is, even otherwise, I think, you know, various trusts, because they are worried whether they will be treated as taxable or not, because of 215, you know, which has become a dangerous tool, the expiration to 215, the proviso. So therefore, you know, a lot of them invested in tax-free bonds, for instance, and claim that as exempt. They would possibly earn income from mutual funds, which would be exempt. So all that trusts were claiming both under section 11 as well as under these sections. So that was a sort of a cushion which was available. Now the amendment says that an institution whose approval is in force under section 1023C and an institution whose exemption registration is in force under section 12AA during the previous year, they will not be entitled to claim any other exemption under section 10 except in respect of agricultural income under section 10(1). So far as the institution which is under section 11, which is approved under section 12AA is concerned, it will be able to claim exemption under section 1023C also. So they will be able to claim under 10(1) or under 1023C, which is claiming exemption under section 11. Now, there are a couple of aspects of this, that this refers to the fact that registration is in force. Now, as you know, section 215 proviso, by virtue of that, you could lose the exemption in spite of having your registration in force. So therefore, because if it is, say, you're carrying on any activity in the nature of trade, commerce or business, or in relation to trade, commerce or business, the exemption can be denied to you. Now what happens to such a trust? Its section 12AA registration is in force. It does not get the benefit of exemption under section 11, but therefore it's not eligible also to claim exemption under section 10. Now this is something which I think is unintended. That's something which I think is really harsh, and really I think should not have. Now of course, the one aspect which Keshav mentioned, that these amendments are all prospective, and one argument I think which all the matters which are in litigation at a lower level today, one can certainly now take the argument that this amendment has come, it is not clarificatory because of the fact that they have not said it's for removal of doubt, it is prospective, and therefore for the earlier years I was entitled to the benefit. I think that is something which one can argue here in this case. Then the next amendment in relation to charitable trusts is in relation to depreciation. As you know, again, this is also in both section 1023C as well as in section 11 and 12. As you know that a charitable trust is entitled to the benefit of claiming a capital expenditure on its objects as an application of income for charitable purposes. So therefore, for that 85%, that expenditure what you incur on charitable purposes, on capital purposes, which is in furtherance of its objects, it can certainly claim it as an application of income. Now, the question was, having done so, can you again claim depreciation on those assets? And there have been a series of decisions. The Delhi and Bombay High Court had taken a view that yes, depreciation is also allowable, even if you had claimed this as an application of the capital expenditure as an application of income for charitable purposes. It does not amount to a double deduction. Even in fact, the Punjab and Haryana High Court also had taken that similar view. There was one contrary decision of the Kerala High Court in the case of Lisi medical institutions, which had taken a contrary view, and I think a subsequent decision of the Delhi High Court also which had taken this view that no, it amounts to a double deduction. And in fact, Lisi medical institutions, I don't know, it really didn't make sense. Of course, they said that in order to reflect the true income that is available for application for charitable purpose, the assessee should write back the depreciation in the account to form part of the income to be accounted for application for charitable purpose. Such notional claim becomes cash surplus available with assessee which remains outside the books of accounts unless it was written back. And charitable institutions were generating unaccounted income equal to depreciation amount claimed on a year-to-year basis, which was nothing but black money. I mean, this was a completely illogical decision. But of course, I mean, the point which they said is that to the extent of the depreciation, therefore you are not spending. That was the logic which was there basically. Now the amendment which is being proposed is that if you have claimed the capital expenditure in an earlier year as an application of income, in the same year or in an earlier year, before the amendment or after the amendment, then from assessment year 2015-16 onwards, you will not be eligible to claim depreciation on those assets as an application of income, as a reduction from the income, because the commercial concept of income, the whole logic for the allowance of depreciation was that the concept of income has to be on a commercial basis as clarified by the CBDT in its 1969 circular for the purpose of section 11 and 12. Now, commercial income means that you necessarily have to have an allowance for depreciation, because depreciation is a necessary outgoing in the commercial concept of income. So that was the logic, and now, so therefore they say that no, you will not be allowed a depreciation on such amount assets in the computation of income if you have claimed this as an application for charitable purposes. The capital part has been claimed as an application for charitable purposes in an earlier year. The next amendment is in respect of, again, charitable trusts. I think there have been quite a few amendments this time, as I said, for charitable trusts. Is under section 12A. Now, this is an amendment which is one of the few amendments which is in favor of the SSE. What happens is, we've seen many cases where charitable organizations claim that they were registered under section 12A, but they're not able to find a certificate of registration. Some of them genuinely were registered, and then they get a duplicate, etc., searching the register at the DIT exemptions office, etc., they find the duplicate copy. But there are many which were under the impression that they were registered but have never been registered. And they have all these years exemption was being given under 11 and 12. Now the return form requires you to mention your 12A registration number, and that's where they suddenly realize that, or at the time of assessment, the assessing officer calls for the registration certificate copy, which is in the standard questionnaire, and then they realize that they don't have it, or that they've never applied for it, and then they apply for the registration. Therefore, what happens is that assessment, the registration, the exemption is denied to them. The subsequent year's assessment until the year of registration, when they apply for registration, get it, until that year, that is also denied. And sometimes there's also a reassessment of earlier years. Now you have an amendment which says that where a charitable trust has been granted registration, on that date, if any assessment is pending, on that assessment, exemption cannot be denied on the ground of non-registration. So therefore, effectively, it amounts to a retrospective grant from the date. That is one. Because earlier you had a situation where under 12A you could have applied, where you were able to explain reasons for delay in application for registration. The commissioner had the power to give you registration from the date of inception of the trust. That was the position which was there. That was taken away a few years back, and now the registration is only from the year in which the application for registration is made. So therefore, this amendment will ensure that you get registration from that effectively it operates even for an earlier year. Not only that, it goes on to say, the amendment goes on to say that no reassessment of completed assessments can be done if on account of such not being registered. So therefore your earlier 6 years is also in a sense saved. And of course, they go on to say that the provisions are not applicable if the registration has been refused or cancelled. Now, I don't know what was the date for this, because if it's refused or cancelled, obviously you are not entitled to benefit of registration, but also the benefit of exemption. But therefore, now what this means is, I think this possibly must have come in for some benefit of some particular type SSEs, some particular SSEs who are affected. Clearly, I think otherwise such a such an amendment giving such a large benefit would not have come. But what this means is that during the course of assessment, if you find that you have not been granted registration, you don't have your registration certificate, you can immediately make an application for registration. If you get it within the period of 6 months, then fortunately you will still be entitled to benefit of exemption. The benefit of exemption will not be lost, I think. But I think the important part over here is, what is the date on which it is effective? Is it the date of application for registration, or is it the date of grant of registration, or the effective date of registration? I would believe that here the language indicates that it is the date of grant of registration and not the effective date nor the date of application. So therefore, of course, there is a 6 months time limit for the commissioner to do so, but within that 6 months time limit, if an assessment gets completed, I think there could be certain problems there. But going by the intention, I think one can still argue that yes, this assessment was open when I made the application, and therefore I should be entitled to the benefit of the exemption. Now, having given one benefit, there is another significant problem which has been created for charitable trusts, and that is section 12AA has been amended with effect from 1st October 2014. And what this amendment says is that where the activities of the trust are carried out in a manner that sections 11 and 12 do not apply by virtue of the provisions of section 13(1). As you know, section 13(1) lays down 4 situations where the trust loses the benefit of exemption under section 11 and 12. One is if the income of the trust does not inure for the benefit of the general public. The second is if the trust is for the benefit of a particular religious community or caste. The third is if the property or income is applied for the benefit of a specified person, which is a trustee, the settlor, the substantial contributor, etc. And lastly, if the funds of the trust are invested in non-permitted modes, that is, which is listed in section 11.5, the permitted modes are listed in 11.5. So if it is invested in any of those, so that is under 11.1b. So therefore, if now the language says, if the activities of the trust are carried out in the manner that 11 and 12 exemption is lost by virtue of section 13(1). Now, what do you mean by activities of the trust are carried out in a manner? So, does it mean that if you have made an inadvertent mistake by investing, say, in a company fixed deposit, and when the mistake was pointed out to you, thereafter you encash that fixed deposit. Of course, you have a provision where you don't lose exemption if you do it by the end of the next financial year. But suppose you've not done it even then, and it's in the third year that you realize that you had invested in a non-permissible mode, and immediately you encashed it prematurely, the fixed deposit. Would this result in a cancellation of registration? What they say is, under this situation, your registration under 12AA will be cancelled. Now, this I think is seems to be fairly harsh, because today what was happening is, if you violated section 13(1)(a) to 13(1)(d), any of those clauses, all happened was that you lost exemption for that particular year. Your 12AA registration continued. Now they're saying that your 12AA registration itself can be cancelled. Now, the fact that they say the activities of trusts are carried out in a manner, I think this indicates that you're carrying out in a manner whereby there is a deliberate violation. So, and this is also supported by the explanatory memorandum, where they said that cases of deliberate violation have been noticed in case of certain trusts doing this, etc. And to overcome this, therefore we are having this provision for cancellation. So, there's also a provision which says that if a reasonable cause is shown for carrying on the activities in such a manner, then your registration will not be cancelled. So, all this I would believe that indicates that it's not just a one-time default which would attract the cancellation of registration, but something which is on an ongoing basis, something which is done deliberately. I think that's the way in which this section would have to be read, I would believe. It's only then that the registration will be cancelled. The problem really is that if the registration is cancelled, then in a year in which you stop doing that, carrying out activity in that particular manner, then you need to again reapply for registration under section 12AA, prove that yes, I have now taken steps to ensure that it does not happen in that manner, etc. So it doesn't mean that you will be totally denied exemption in the future, but again the headache of going through the 12AA, and the experience shows that the commissioner generally is very reluctant to grant 12AA registration. So therefore one has to go all the way up to the tribunal to really get the benefit of the registration. So that's the hassle which will be caused. The last amendment relating to charitable trusts, I think there are quite, as I said, is in relation to section 115 BBC, which deals with anonymous donations. As you know, anonymous donations are taxable at 30% in case of certain trusts, which is charitable trusts or charitable religious trusts, if the donation is for educational institution or for a medical institution, etc. Now, what is taxable is not the entire amount of anonymous donations. What is taxable is the total amount of anonymous donations less 5% of the total donations received, or 1 lakh, whichever is higher. So say suppose you have your total donations are say 30 lakh rupees, you've got say 10 lakhs rupees by way of interest, so your total income is 40 lakhs. Now, out of the 30 lakh donations that you have, 5 lakhs is anonymous donations. The way it would operate is, that 5% of 30 lakhs works out to 1,50,000, which is more than 1 lakh rupees. So therefore, 5 lakhs less 1,50,000, 3,50,000 will be subjected to tax at 30%. The law as it now stands is that for the purpose of section 11 and 12, you consider the gross income less this anonymous donations. So therefore, what were you looking? You will take 40 lakhs less 5 lakhs. On 35 lakhs, you are considering application of sections 11 and 12. That was the way it was working today. They realized that this 1.5 lakhs which was allowed to you, which was not taxed as an anonymous donation, was not even considered for section 11 and 12, and therefore that amendment has now been brought in, saying that no, so far as the remaining income is concerned, whatever is the anonymous donation which has been taxed, in this case 3.5 lakhs, that will be excluded, and the remaining will have to be considered for section 11 and 12. So therefore today it will be 40 lakhs less 3.5 lakhs, 36.5 lakhs, which will have to be considered for the purpose of section 11 and 12. Then coming to what I'll do is I'll take up this business trusts at the end. I think let's quickly run through the other amendments. Income from house property, one self-occupied house property whose annual value is taken at nil. As you know, if the loan is taken after 1999, the limit is 1,50,000 for the last 15 years. That limit is now being increased to 2 lakh rupees. Of course, if you have joint owners of property, etc., each of the joint owners will get this benefit of 2 lakhs. That's something which I think is obvious. The amendment relating to capital gains, and let's come to that. You have section 45(5), which says that in the event of compulsory acquisition by the government, or when the consideration for an acquisition is fixed by the government or by the Reserve Bank of India, then what happens, how is it taxed? It basically says that the initial compensation that you make is taxable in the year of receipt of the compensation. The subsequent enhanced compensation, if it is enhanced by an order of a tribunal court, etc., enhanced compensation is taxable in the year of receipt. Now what was happening is, take a situation where you had initial compensation of say 10 lakhs given to you by the collector. Say that 10 lakhs was immediately given to you. That is taxable in say the year of receipt itself. You went saying that no, I should not get 10 lakhs, I am entitled to 1 crore. You went to the tribunal. The tribunal under an interim order says, pay him 50 lakh rupees more. So under that interim order, this 50 lakhs was taxable as your income, as in when you received it. But subsequently, the tribunal held that no, what you are entitled to total compensation is not 1 crore is claimed by you, it's only 50 lakhs. And you have already received 10 lakhs plus 50 lakhs. So subsequently you would have to give back the 10 lakhs to the government along with interest, etc. You would have to give it back. Now there was no provision for reducing this from your income in the subsequent year when the tribunal passed the final order. So therefore what they are now providing is that where an enhanced compensation is received for under an interim order of a tribunal court, etc., or any other authority, this will be taxable in the year of final order and not in the year of receipt. So therefore what will happen is there are 3 types. Let's look at this same situation, that in year 1 when you get the 10 lakhs, that 10 lakhs is taxable. When you get the interim compensation of 50 lakhs, that amount is not taxable. But when the final order is passed, it's in that year that amount, whatever the amount, which is 40 lakhs in this case, would be taxable in the year in which the final order is passed. Now there could be a situation where this could work the other way. Instead of giving you 50 lakhs as compensation, the final order may say you are entitled to 75 lakhs. Now, therefore, you are getting another 15 lakhs finally. Now, that 15 lakhs will not be taxable in the year of final order, but that will be taxable in the year of actual receipt. So that's something which again, there could be a difference between the year of final order and the actual receipt by the taxpayer, but that is something. So therefore, you'll have three sort of situations: initial compensation in the year of receipt, the final compensation and the enhanced compensation which is determined under final order in the final again on receipt, but the enhanced compensation which was received under an interim order will be taxable in the year of final order. Then there is one amendment in on section 47(7)(b), which is transfer of government securities carrying periodic payment of interest outside India would be through an intermediary who deals with settlement of securities will be exempt. Now again, this will affect mainly non-residents. It won't apply to treasury bills. As you know, treasury bills are issued at a discount and they don't carry a periodic interest. They are redeemed at par but issued at a discount. So therefore, treasury bills this would not apply. But other government securities which pay 6 monthly or annual interest, etc., they would get the benefit. On capital gains, next amendment is on cost inflation index, where the consumer price index for urban non-manual employees is being replaced by the consumer price index urban. Well, I really don't know what is the implication of this in terms of the amounts which would be, but the reason given is that this index which was earlier being used is now being discontinued, and therefore the other index is being substituted for that. As you know, for the current year already the index has been notified of 1024, so this will be operative effectively from next year. The next and very significant amendment is in relation to forfeiture of an advance received for or on received for under this agreement for sale of a capital asset. You know, you have section 51 which says that if you have entered, if you have received an advance towards transfer of a capital asset and the transfer of that capital asset does not happen and you forfeit that advance, then whatever was the forfeited amount is to be reduced from your cost of acquisition. And you had decisions of the Supreme Court in the case of Travancore Rubber, you had the Delhi High Court decision in the case of Mira Goel, where they took a view that even if this advance exceeds the cost, still it cannot be taxed in that year. It's only in the year of ultimate sale of the capital asset that the taxability will arise. Now what they say is that the advance received for the sale of a capital against sale of a capital asset and forfeited without transfer of capital asset would be taxable as income from other sources. So you have a new clause inserted under section 56(2) which says that this will now be taxable as income from other sources. So what happens is, earlier it would have been taxable as capital gain, most probably long-term capital gains in most cases, so therefore you're paying 20%. Now you will end up paying 30% in most cases because if you're in the 30% slab. The second thing is, earlier what would happen is you would pay tax on it only in the year of final transfer of the capital asset. Now you're paying tax on the year of forfeiture. So therefore both the year of payment has been advanced as well as the rate has been enhanced. Now I was told, you know, some cases, some agreements you have a situation where there's an automatic forfeiture which is provided for in the agreement, that within 3 months if the transaction is not completed, it will be forfeited. But say for instance the seller does not really forfeit it and the sale is completed say after 6 months. Now what happens in that situation? Can this be taxed as income from other sources? I would believe that not. It cannot be taxed in that situation, because just because you have a right to forfeit does not mean that there is an actual forfeiture. So therefore it's something which you know, one can say that really the very fact that you know the transfer has actually taken place, though maybe in a subsequent year, and therefore in this situation this should not be taxable as in this particular year. That is so. I think it's very important from that perspective to provide, I think, in the agreements that instead of an automatic forfeiture, provide that you have the right to forfeit, but not automatic forfeiture. There has to be an actual act of forfeiture. It would be better from your perspective to avoid litigation. Then the amendments relating to exemption under section 54 and 54F. As you know that you had various high courts taking the view that the exemption which is available for reinvestment in a residential house under section 54 and 54F, which refer to a residential house, they said because of the General Clauses Act says singular includes plural, therefore a would include more than one house also. So therefore even if you bought more than one house at two different locations, though they may not be necessarily be adjacent to each other, you would still be entitled to the benefit of the exemption. You had the Karnataka High Court in Anand Basappa and Rukminamma and the Andhra Pradesh High Court in Said Adil's case, where this such a view was taken. There is another series of decisions of the Bombay High Court in the case of Raman Kumar Suri and Devdas Naik, and the Delhi High Court in the case of Geeta Dugal, where this was a situation where these were adjacent to each other or one below each other and they were connected in a sense. So there these courts have taken a view that really this is being used as one house. It is one, though because it is under the same structure, it is really being used as one house, and therefore it amounts to a acquisition of a residential house in that situation. So that was the view which had been taken by the Bombay High Court and Delhi High Court. Now the amendment is that instead of a residential house, the term one residential house is to be used. So the question here is, certainly, so if you buy one house here in Bombay and one house in Pune, certainly you will not get the benefit of the exemption now going forward from assessment year 2015-16. But if you buy two flats side by side, the builder said demolishes the connecting wall in between, he seals off one entrance and you have only one entrance to the two, you have only one kitchen, etc. So before getting possession, if this happens, then I would certainly feel that this is what you have acquired is only one residential house, because it is really, it cannot, it's not be, though it may be on the municipal records as two residential units, it is still one residential house. The problem really is, if the builder, it's not the builder who does it, but you buy two flats and then combine it. And that is where the problem is, because for purchase of what have you purchased? Have you purchased one residential house or have you purchased two residential houses? That's the question which I think where the litigation would lie now today, and under this amendment.
Two different existing inside.
Yes, that's what Raman Kumar Suri was exactly that, a penthouse with staircase in between. Yes, that would be allowed. The other amendment on this is that earlier you had the Bombay tribunal decision in case of Prema Shah. I think there was another Chennai tribunal decision also on that, and a contrary decision of the Ahmedabad tribunal in the case of Leena Shah, where they said that the house in Bombay tribunal said the house could be outside India. A non-resident sold the residential house in India, bought a house outside, residential house outside India. The Bombay tribunal said there's nothing in the section which says that it has to be in India. But the Ahmedabad tribunal said no, looking at the rationale to encourage housing in India, etc. So therefore it has to be necessarily in India. Now this is also being amended, saying that one residential house in India. So therefore, you cannot have a situation where you buy a residential house outside India. And unfortunately, after this amendment, now the Reserve Bank again permits you to use the LRS scheme to buy a residential house outside India. So that has come, of course, saying that the $125,000 you can use to buy a residential house outside India. So residents, in any case now, don't get the benefit of capital gain exemption, though you can buy a residential house outside India. But as I said, this is an amendment which has, now of course, again, this is a prospective amendment, not for removal or doubt. So therefore, I think given the earlier, if you have litigation for earlier years, possibly one can say that yes, the benefit now you have the benefit that this is a prospective, the fact that it is made prospectively and not applicable to earlier year, I think it's something which one can claim the benefit. Then 54EC, which gives you exemption from capital gains for reinvestment in capital gains bonds issued by a National Highway Authority and REC. You have the exemption which is available there for reinvestment of long-term capital gains in these assets. You had a proviso which was inserted a few years ago, which said that provided that the investment in such bond in any previous year shall not exceed rupees 50 lakhs. So question was, what happens if you sell the capital asset, say in the month of November? Now if you sell it in the month of November, you have 6 months time to reinvest. So you have time up to May to reinvest. So suppose if you invest 50 lakhs in the month of March and you invest another 50 lakhs in the month of May, can you claim the exemption of 1 crore? That was the question which arose. And there a majority of the tribunals, Ahmedabad, Panji, Bangalore, Chennai had taken a view, even recently Bombay I think had taken a view that in this case you are entitled to the benefit of 1 crore. There was one contrary view of the Jaipur tribunal in Rajkumar Jain HUF, which had said that no, this it's the exemption itself is limited to 50 lakhs. Frankly speaking, I think all the other tribunals have said that they could very well have said that the limit of the exemption shall not exceed 50 lakhs in a particular year. There was no need to talk about investment in a particular year shall not exceed. Well, anyway, now going forward from assessment in 2015-16 onwards, capital gains, the benefit of capital gains bond will be available whether the first year or the second year put together will be 50 lakhs is the limit. Again, as I said, this is another amendment which is prospective, so therefore up to assessment year 14-15, I think one can claim the benefit of this exemption of 50 lakhs plus 50 lakhs. I think that would be something which would be available. The next amendment in definition of capital assets is in the definition period of holding of short-term capital asset under section 242A. As you know, today the period of holding for asset to qualify as long-term capital assets is more than 12 months. If it's 12 months or less, it's a short-term capital asset. The proviso to section 242A says that in respect of shares and in respect of units of mutual funds plus some other assets, instead of 36 months, instead of 36 months, the period will be 12 months. So therefore, 36 months is the normal period. For these specific assets, the period would be 12 months. So the question was that equity shares of private limited companies, the period was being regarded as 12 months. For equity, for all mutual fund units, whether it was equity oriented funds or debt funds, etc., the period was 12 months. Now the amendment says that holding period for units other than equity oriented mutual funds, mutual funds, and for unlisted shares. So unlisted shares and others other than equity oriented mutual funds, for them the period is now be back to 36 months. So what happens is, in fact the UN cry which is there is of course about these fixed maturity plans. The way these fixed maturity plans worked was, suppose you invested in March 2013 and it was maturing, it would be for a period of 13 months, it would mature in April 2014. So you have invested in the finance, it was a long term asset because more than 12 months. What was happening is they would invest it in company deposits or corporate bonds, etc., which were maturing in 13 months. The mutual fund would invest it in that. You were entitled to the benefit of 2 years indexation because of the fact that you invested in the financial year 2012-13 and you were exiting in the financial year 2014-15. So you were entitled to 2 years, the benefit of 2 years indexation. With this double indexation, effectively you did not pay any capital gains tax. There were FMPs, of course, which were of 1 year also, which would give you a single indexation, where the tax payable at 20% of the indexed gain was much lower, and therefore really you are getting a significant benefit in these units. All that will now, what will happen is, firstly, this will now be regarded as short term, because most FMPs were for less than 3 years. So all these will now be regarded as short term. The second is that this will now, being short term, it will be taxable at the slab rate of tax. In most cases it will be 33.99% or 30.90% instead of almost nil tax. Therefore there, I think on this there has been a huge hue and cry, and people saying that even those whose units have been matured between April 1st to 10th of July, they also have, in spite of the fact that the transaction is complete, they've lost the benefit of, so therefore this is really a retrospective taxation. Though the finance minister said in his finance speech that retrospective taxation will be resorted to very rarely. But this, I think, has escaped because of the fact that the budget is being presented in July this year instead of February. That's why this is happening in a sense. So they've, I understand that of course, they're talking about reconsidering it. So the amendment which hopefully will be moved will be that either it will not apply to units which have been transferred prior to the date of the budget, or it may be that all units acquired prior to the date of budget, it may not apply to them. This amendment, of course, also affects debt funds, it affects gold funds, it will affect gold ETFs. The overseas funds which you have, fund of funds, they are really invested in shares of foreign companies. It will apply to shares of private limited companies also. For them also now the holding period will be 36 months. The other amendment in capital gains is in relation to the definition of capital asset. And the amendment is that holding of securities by foreign institutional investors will be regarded as capital assets. Now, the foreign institutional investor scheme has been replaced by the foreign portfolio investor scheme. So, foreign portfolio investors includes foreign companies, foreign citizens who are not NRIs or PIOs. So, that is clarified by the explanatory memorandum that it would apply now to all foreign portfolio investors and not just FIIs, though the language in the Income Tax Act is FIIs. The finance minister said this is to bring certainty as to whether this is capital gains or business income. Now, this is again one of the areas where actually he has increased the tax liability on FII or foreign investors, really. Now, how would this operate? Firstly, most FIIs today are not coming through Singapore, Mauritius or Cyprus, where the capital gains is exempt under those treaties. Most of them are coming directly, say for instance the US. Almost all the US FIIs are coming directly. So therefore, under the tax treaty, the capital gains is taxable in India. If it was business income, it would not have been taxable in India unless there was a permanent establishment in India. So therefore, really, they would now end up having to pay the capital gains tax compulsorily. Earlier, if they had taken the standard it was business income, of course, I think most FIIs were, I understand, paying this tax. Long-term capital gains would not get impacted because most of it is on the stock exchanges. So therefore, under Section 1038, the exemption would apply. But the interesting part is that even derivatives are securities. So derivatives also would be regarded as capital assets now. Now, trading in derivatives, I was told that almost all FIIs treat trading in derivatives as business income, and in the absence of PE, don't pay tax in India. Now, all that will be taxable in India, and there will be no treaty protection available, because this will now fall under capital gains. So unless it has come in via Mauritius or Singapore, etc. And this will, under 115AD, this will be taxable at 33.99%, and not, fortunately, not at 40% plus surcharge. That's the good only saving thing, that under 115AD, instead of being exempt. So therefore, I think this is one area where there will be a significant inflow of taxes to the government on this count. But what will happen to the trading on the stock market in derivatives is something which remains to be seen. Whether it will drive away derivative trading to foreign markets is a question. So that completes the amendments relating to capital gains. Then let's look at business income. You have 32AC, which is a form of an investment allowance which was introduced last year. It was applicable for assessment year 2014-15 and 15-16. What was the amendment last year? The amendment was that if the total cost of new plant and machinery installed by you during assessment years 2014-15 and 15-16 exceeded 100 crores, then you would get a deduction of 15% of the cost of such new plant and machinery. And you had exclusions for various items such as office appliances and computers and vehicles, etc. Those were excluded. Or second-hand plant and machinery, whether used in India or outside India, that was excluded. Now, so the limit was 100 crores. You had to spend that 100 crores over a period of, acquire and install assets from a new plant and machinery over a period of 2 years. Now the amendment is that they said that we realize that this limit of 100 crores is too high. So therefore, with effect from assessment year 2015-16, we are saying that a new subclause 1A is being inserted to section 32AC, which is applicable from assessment year 2015-16 till assessment year 2017-18. This says that if the value of new plant and machinery acquired and installed during any particular of these 3 years is more than 25 crore rupees, then you will get 15% of the value of such new plant and machinery as a deduction. 15% of the cost of new plant and machinery. Now this, one thing you have to remember, this provision section 32AC applies only to a company which is manufacturing articles or things. So this is again therefore only for companies. It does not apply to non-corporates such as partnership firms or LLPs or proprietary concerns. They cannot claim this benefit. The other thing is that they have provided that if you're claiming an allowance under subsection 1, that is the 100 crore criteria, because 100 crores is obviously also more than 25 crores. So can you claim both? No, if you're claiming under subsection 1 for assessment year 15-16, both subsection 1 and subsection 1A coexist. You can only get under subsection 1, and then you cannot get under subsection 1A in that situation. Or if today, for instance, last year you have installed say 100 crores in assessment year 14-15, in assessment year 15-16 you invest say 30 crores, then again you can get only under subsection 1, you cannot get under subsection 1A. That is the way the amendment is. The other provision which is there is that if this new asset is transferred within 5 years from the date of installation, except unless the such transfer is pursuant to amalgamation or demerger, then whatever was the deduction which you had got under section 32AC is deemed to be income in the year of such transfer of the asset. So for 5 years you got to continue to hold that asset. Now, as I said, this is again only for companies which are manufacturing articles or things. So therefore construction companies, infrastructure companies, all, they will not be able to claim such a benefit. So the other thing is that it uses the language, if you see the terminology, it says acquires and install new assets, and the actual cost of such new assets acquired and installed exceeds 25 crores. So which means that both acquisition and installation is important, and for the same assets. So therefore, if you have a situation where you acquire in say assessment year 15-16 and you install in assessment year 16-17, you will not get the benefit the way the language is currently. Similarly, if you have acquired in say assessment year 14-15 and or say you acquired in assessment year 15-16 25 crores, you install that in assessment year 16-17. In 16-17 also you acquired 25 crores, but you install them in the next year again. There also the benefit may not be available because it's not the same assets which are acquired and installed. The assets acquired and installed have to be exceed 25 crores. That's the unfortunate way. Of course, possibly I think the courts may read it down and say that no, what is the intention? The intention is that you install and start putting it to use, and therefore in that situation you may still get the benefit. But I think this is something which could be a problem. The other aspect is you get a deduction from your income. This is not a debit to your profit and loss account. So for your book profits don't change. So you still continue to have the MAT liability. So therefore, MAT liability is something which will still continue in spite of this investment allowance. The next amendment under business is in respect of these capital linked deductions which are available under section 35AD. You have this list of 11 businesses which are eligible for what we call as accelerated depreciation. In a sense, you get the capital expenditure as a deduction in the year of installation and putting to use. So therefore, that is extended now to slurry pipeline for transportation of iron ore and semiconductor wafer fabrication manufacturing unit. But new conditions have been put in which apply to all the 13 businesses, and that is that the asset is to be used only for the specified business for a period of 8 years. How do you compute this period of 8 years? The 8 years you calculate from the beginning, from the previous year in which the asset is acquired or constructed. So therefore you have to calculate from the year in which it is acquired is the first year. So that way, so it's not from the actual date of installation, which is important. Now, section 28(7) says that if such an asset is demolished, destroyed, discarded or transferred, then whatever was the deduction which was availed of under section 35AD will be taxed in that year of destruction, demolition, etc. or transfer.
Put to use is required?
See, what they've said, I think the language here is installation and this one second, 35AD. I think you will have to
Acquire and install likha hai.
Acquire and install. Installation is important. Installation. Put to use is not required. Installation is required. But installation means, obviously once it's installed, you would want to put it to use, except in rare situations where that put to use may not be available. So what they say is, so in situations other than section 28(7), if it is used for any other purpose, this asset is used for any other purpose other than the specified business, then whatever was the cost which was allowed to you as a deduction, less the depreciation which would have been allowable to you over that period, that will be deemed to be income. So therefore they are giving you the benefit of depreciation which would have been allowable to you over that. But unfortunately, there is no provision to say that this will be added to your WDV there in that situation. So that is something which is missing here, unfortunately. Therefore one will have to try and see if you can fit it in somehow. There is an exception for SICK industrial companies, so for them it's not necessary that they continue to use the same asset for the specified business for this period of 5 years, for the period of 8 years, sorry. The next business expenditure which we'll deal with is in relation to CSR expenditure. As you know that many companies have been incurring expenditure for, as good corporate citizens, in a sense they would incur, say for instance, we have many case laws which deal with a situation where a company sets up a school close by to its factory premises so that the benefit is available to employees' children, but incidentally the benefit also goes to the entire area. The courts have taken the view that this is expenditure incurred wholly and exclusively for the purpose of business, even if it incidentally benefits others, so it qualifies for deduction. You now have section 135 of the Companies Act 2013, which says that every company having a net worth of 500 crore or more or net profit of 5 crore or more has to ensure that the company spends at least 2% of the average net profits of the company made during the 3 immediately preceding financial years on such corporate social responsibility. They have listed out the list of items on which you have to spend it. The question here is this incurred for the purpose of business? I would feel that yes, normally it would be incurred for the purpose of business, because you necessarily have to incur the expenditure because you're a company, because you're carrying on this business which is yielding this income, therefore you necessarily have to incur this expenditure. But the government unfortunately seems to think otherwise. They're saying that if we give you allowable this deduction as a deduction, this allowance amounts to giving you a subsidy of 1/3 for such expenditure. They say it's really an application of income and not really expenditure incurred for earning the income. And therefore the amendment is that it will be deemed not to be business expenditure for the purpose of section 37(1). So the amendment is only in respect of 37(1). The explanation has been added to section 37(1). Incidentally, what they say is that any expenditure falling under the explanatory memorandum, if you look at, since the amendment is only in 37(1), expenditure which falls under other sections may be allowable. So therefore, if you look at page 14 of the explanatory memorandum, that gives you this. So therefore, rent, taxes, repairs, insurance, possibly I think one can still claim the benefit of the deduction for even though it's incurred on CSR if one is able to show that it is for the purposes of business, etc. The other interesting thing is that deduction under section 35AC, for instance, you can carry on a CSR through a trust. The trust may have its registration under section 35AC, approval under section 35AC. Now there you will get a deduction under section 35AC. So that is something which is very clearly available in this. So that's one good thing. Of course, ATG in any case would be available if not falling under any of these sections. I think ATG is something which will certainly be allowable as a deduction if the trust is registered under section ATG. Then coming to the two provisions relating to disallowance in case of non-deduction of TDS. You have 40A1 which deals with cases of non-deduction from TDS from payments to non-residents. There you had the time limit for if you did not deduct and pay the TDS within the previous year or before the due date for paying the TDS under the law. Then in that situation it was to be disallowed and allowed in the year in which the TDS was deducted and paid. Now this is brought on par with section 40A1A by saying that even if you pay the TDS before the due date of filing of the return, that is good enough. So therefore you will get the benefit of the deduction. This applies again with effect from assessment year 15-16. So far as 40A1A is concerned, there are two amendments really. One is that the disallowance which was earlier 100% of the expenditure will now be restricted to 30% of the expenditure. So in a situation where there is short deduction, of course we have tribunals and the High Court taking a view that it does not apply at all to cases of short deduction where there is genuine belief that it's under this section, etc. But leaving aside those cases, but if there is a short deduction, say for instance instead you deduct only 50% of the TDS where the rate was say 2%, you deduct only 1%. Their proportionate disallowance is something which was the view, and therefore now what would happen is 30% of such proportionate disallowance would apply in those cases. The other thing is, the problem is that where in this connection is that where there was a disallowance say in assessment year 14-15 and the allowance now in subsequent year in 15-16 there is an allowance. Unfortunately, the language is such that even in the year of allowance, it will be only 30% and not 100%. Now that seems to be a drafting error which hopefully would have got corrected, but that's the way it is, that you will only get 30% the way the language is currently. The other amendment in section 40A1A is, earlier you had a specific list of items. It was royalties, fees for technical services, rent, commission, brokerage, etc. So there was only on the specified items it applied. There were certain items to which it did not apply, such as director's fees, it did not apply to salaries, it did not apply to non-compete fees. Now the amendment is any amounts on which tax is deductible. So therefore all items which are subject to TDS, it will apply to expenditure of such items, it will apply, 40A1A will apply to this with effect from assessment in 2015-16. The interesting thing which you need to note is, you have today under section 194IA, a deduction which is required in case of purchase of immovable property. Now immovable property may be purchased by a builder as a stock in trade. If he purchases an immovable property as a stock in trade, now there also this disallowance will apply if he does not deduct TDS. So that's something which I think one needs to take care that this TDS is, because that could result in a significant disallowance.
In case of salaries, regular salaries, the disallowance clause is not there.
Now it will come.
Now it will be included.
It's included. It's because now all amounts on which.
The immovable property, but when the expenditure, when immovable property capital expenditure is not the reduction, so we only a depreciation.
No, then there's no problem. There's no problem. It's only where it's stock in trade because that's an expenditure. It's purchase. The next amendment is in section 44A, which is deals with presumptive income for persons plying good carriages of up to 10 goods carriages. Earlier, the limit was 5,000 rupees for heavy goods carriages per month and 4,500 for other goods carriages, 4,500 per month. Now it's increased to 7,500 per month, irrespective of whether it's a heavy goods carriage or whether it's other type of good carriage. So that is the one other amendment which, though it deals with business losses, I will deal with it over here, and that is in relation to section 73. Section 73 prohibits set off of speculation losses against any other business income or any other income. is treated as a separate category of income, of loss itself. Now, you had an explanation to section 73 which says that any company deriving income from trading in shares would be regarded as, that income, the loss from such activity would be deemed to be speculation loss. Now, there was an exception there which says that companies whose principal business is that of banking, or companies whose principal business is that of granting of loans and advances, or a company whose gross total income mainly consists of income from other sources, capital gains or house property income, those companies were excluded from that explanation. So therefore, what was happening is, in case of share trading companies, there was a lot of litigation. How does one look at the composition of the share trading income? For instance, if there is a share trading loss and there is some nominal other profit, the overall income is a loss. Now, how does one work out which is higher than the other, etc.? Is the positive greater than the loss, and when the overall income is a loss, etc.? So those were issues which had gone before the courts. Now, fortunately, at least so far share trading companies are concerned, they are excluding share trading companies, and they say that this will not apply to a company whose principal business is that of trading in shares. Now, how does one determine principal business is a question, and I think perhaps one can take a cue from the NBFC directions that where more than 50% of the income is from this activity of share trading, where more than 50% of the assets are from are in respect of this business of share trading. Perhaps one can, that would certainly be a principal business. Interestingly, this would not apply to a company whose principal business is that of trading in other securities, say government securities, or whose principal business is that of trading in derivatives. It is only for shares trading companies that this exception has been carved out. So for those companies, the activity of dealing in shares would still be regarded as speculative loss, the loss from that activity. Then coming to the chapter 68 deductions, ATC, as you know, all of you know, from 1 lakh it's gone up to 1,50,000. PPF limit is also being enhanced, but one will have to wait for the notification for that PPF limit to really come into force. But there are a couple of other amendments, and one is in ATCCD, where this limit which applies for employee NPS contribution. There was no limit earlier, but you had an overall limit under section ATCCE, which applied to ATC, ATCCC and ATCCD. That limit was 1 lakh. So that limit has gone up to 1,50,000, but a sub limit also has been introduced in ATCCD1 of 1 lakh rupees. So only 1 lakh rupees of NPS contribution will qualify, though the total under ATCCE is 1,50,000. ATI for power sector, that businesses commencing activities before 31st March 2014 was the limit. Now that limit is extended by 3 years to 31st March 2017. So therefore, of course, today there was a newspaper report that windmill manufacturers will get the accelerated depreciation is again being restored. I was told that it was there in the finance minister's Hindi budget speech, but it was not in the English version of the budget speech, etc. And then it was clarified that no, the English version is final, but it seems to be coming back. I think the Hindi version seems to be final now, and it seems to be, because ultimately I think they will probably move an amendment when they move the finance bill for. 2 or 3 amendments relating to transfer pricing, and under section 92B2, a transaction with an unrelated person was also regarded as a transaction for the purpose of transfer pricing. If there was a prior agreement between such person and the associated enterprise, or where the terms in substance between me and this unrelated person were determined by that associated enterprise and that unrelated person. Say for instance, take a situation where, say, Colgate-Palmolive India. Colgate-Palmolive India buys, say, the packing material from a particular supplier, and that particular supplier has a worldwide agreement with Colgate-Palmolive USA that this particular packing material will be supplied at X price. So because the Colgate-Palmolive USA and that supplier have an agreement at which price it is to be supplied to me, therefore that is regarded as a transaction which would be governed by the transfer price. There was a doubt as to whether a transaction between 2 residents, if it was a non-resident, it was fine, then it was certainly an international transaction. But if it was a transaction between 2 residents, say the supplier is a resident of India, then what happens? And he still has an agreement with Colgate-Palmolive US to supply, worldwide at this price. There they said that no, even there in that situation, this will be regarded as an international transaction, because of the fact that really the terms are in substance determined by that associated enterprise, which is a non-resident entity. Now the Again, this amendment is with effect from assessment 2015-16. So therefore, possibly for up to assessment 2014-15, one can take the view that this is something which would not apply to a transaction with a resident. It would apply. It would not be an international transaction, though it would be a transaction. The second difficulty is that this applies to any type of transaction and not necessarily the type of transaction referred to in section 92B1 or the explanation which lists out the various types of transactions. Of course, those types of transactions I think are quite exhaustive, so one would have to maybe scratch one's head to try and find a transaction which does not fall within that. The other amendment is in respect of advance pricing arrangements. An advance pricing arrangement is valid for a period of 5 years, beginning from the year in which it is entered into. Now what they're saying is to put an end to litigation. You may choose to say that the advance pricing arrangement is applicable for that year in which it is and 4 earlier years. So up to 5 years, again the limit remains 5 years, but you could choose to apply it for the earlier years. You may want to enter into a separate advance pricing arrangement for the next 5 years. That's the amendment. But this amendment is with effect from 1st October 2014, so it would not apply to advance pricing arrangements entered into before that date, so which are already concluded before that date. There is a penalty today which is leviable under section 271G if you do not produce certain documents or records sought for by the assessing officer or the CIT appeals. Under 92D3 if you do not furnish those documents. Today the penalty can be levied only by the assessing officer or the CIT appeals. But typically what happens is that transaction is really examined by the transfer pricing officer. So therefore they have now given that power to the transfer pricing officer also to levy the penalty under section 271G. Then coming to some special rates of tax, you had this special rate for foreign currency borrowings which was applicable up to 1st July 2015, where the 5% rate was applicable. Now that 5% rate has been extended by 2 years till 1st July 2017, all borrowings up to 1st July 2017 from the effective date, I think it was 1st July 2013 onwards. So the 5% rate would apply to all borrowings now made up to 1st July 2017. Currently only loans and infrastructure bonds are covered, but now they have extended it to all bonds issued by, so it would not be just infrastructure bonds, but this amendment is effective from 1st October 2014. And corresponding amendments are made for TDS also. Actually, the main provisions are found in TDS, and 115A merely refers to the section of TDS here. Foreign company dividends, as you know, have a concessional rate of tax of 15%, but it is at a flat rate. There is no deduction available against foreign company dividends. That was available up to 31st March 2014. That has now been extended indefinitely. So that will benefit, or rather disadvantage in some cases, will continue indefinitely. Coming to alternate minimum tax. As you know, alternate minimum tax is applicable to non-corporates. Corporates have MAT. Section 115 JC provides for that. Today, how do you calculate the alternate minimum tax? What you would do is take the total income, add to that the deduction claimed under section 10AA, and add deduction claimed under Part C of Chapter 6A. Part C of Chapter 6A dealt with the profit-linked deductions such as ATIA, ATIB, ATIC, etc. So you would add those amounts or the deduction under 10AA, and on that adjusted total income you would then calculate the 18.5% and compare it with the actual tax liability. So now they have added one more item to that, section 35AD. 35AD, as we saw, the capital expenditure which is allowed as a deduction, that is also to be added. The only fortunate part is that they've said that okay, whatever is the depreciation which would have been allowable, that will be deducted. So it's not just addition of the gross amount of deduction, but the depreciation will be considered in there. In fact, interestingly, possibly one can one take the stand that even the additional depreciation also one can maybe claim, because their depreciation allowable under section 32. So even additional depreciation one can possibly. So far as AMT credit was concerned, section 115 JEE provided for that. Now there was some doubt that the language was such that if, say for instance, in year 1 you pay alternate minimum tax, in year 2 you don't have any section 10AA deduction, or you don't have ATIA, AT/IB profits, etc. So therefore there is no calculation of an alternate minimum tax over there. Now so therefore the question was, the language was such as that you had to have that if you wanted a credit. So which would mean that it would have been really non-workable, because it would not have applied to you in a year, because you get the benefit really only in a year in which your normal tax was there. So now they're saying that irrespective of whether you claim, whether Section 10AA, Section 30, 35 AD or any deduction under Part C of Chapter 6 is claimed in that particular subsequent year, you will get the benefit of the credit. And what would happen in that year? You will work out what is the tax on, because your adjusted minimum, the income, adjusted total income would remain the same as your total income because there is no addition required. So therefore you will effectively get 30.5, 30 minus 18.5, so that 11.5 is what you will get effectively, because 30 is your normal rate of tax, 18.5 is, assuming that you're in the high slab, and 18.5 is the concessional rate, so therefore you will get to the extent of 11.5 is what you would get. Then there are some amendments in the provisions on reference to valuation officer. A reference to a valuation officer today could have been made during the course of assessment proceedings if for the purpose of making valuation of an asset for determination of income under Section 68, 69, 69B, etc., all those items. Now there was some doubt as to whether this could be made if the books of accounts are not rejected, because what you're doing is something which is recorded in the books of accounts. What you want to do is you want to make an addition, and therefore it has now, the amendment is the whole section has been substituted that the reference to the valuation officer can be made irrespective of whether the books of accounts are rejected or not. The report has to be given by the valuation officer within a period of 6 months to the assessing officer and to the assessee. There is no consequence provided if the report is not given within a period of 6 months, but we'll see later what happens. The limitation period for completion of assessment now gets extended by the period from which the date of reference to the valuation officer to the date on which the report is received from the valuation officer. So which means that if an assessing officer he wants to some more time to make an assessment, he can merely make a reference to the valuation officer and he gets 6 months more time to effectively make that. That is unfortunate, this one. But what happens if there is a delay of beyond 6 months? Does that period also get delayed? I think no, it cannot extend beyond that period of 6 months. At the most, the assessment limitation period could get, so if the valuation officer takes a longer time to give the report, I don't think the assessment can be delayed beyond the period of 6 months, because the time limit for the valuation officer is really a period of 6 months. The other important amendment is relation to income computation and disclosure standards, and which I think Chetan will be also dealing with. See, we had this concept under Section 145, tax accounting standards. If they are not followed, then a best judgment assessment can be made. We had the committee which was set up in 2010 saying that to notify tax account to work on tax accounting standards, and there was, I think, some 16 standards which they had drafted. Representations were made before the committee that in fact the committee said that tax accounting standards need not be followed in the books of accounts. It is only for computation purposes. Now, which means, how can you have an accounting standard without looking even at the books of account? I mean, this was something which was ridiculous. But therefore, they have recommended, this was pointed out, that you cannot have a tax accounting standard which is, not to be followed in the accounts. So then they have recommended to the government that you please amend Section 145, and therefore this amendment has now come, that income computation and disclosure standards. Now, frankly speaking, I think this is something which is really going to create havoc, because what will happen is that any change can be made just by amending the the income computation disclosure standard, and which could be done overnight by the government. It can just has to notify that. That's all. Now, this is something which so you don't have to amend the act at all. Today, if you have to amend the act, you have to go through the procedure of going through Parliament, etc. All that is not required. This is something which is really going to create problems. For instance, I think one of the things which they had given was revenue recognition. Now, even all professionals would have to follow the revenue recognition standard. Therefore, you value the work in progress at the year end. So can you imagine the assessment or some appeal is going on, you try and imagine what is the percentage of work which you have completed, what you are going to charge for the full thing, work out. I think it's, for accounting for contractors. Now, according to me, in this income computation disclosure standards, even if you don't have to follow it in books of accounts, practically you will have to really maintain books of accounts, particularly if you are a contractor, etc. Because the way this is, that you will definitely, you cannot work it out, even for revenue recognition. You really have to maintain one more set of books of accounts for tax purposes. So, the old saying used to be there, that people would have two sets of books of accounts, one official set of accounts and rather one for the tax officer and one for themselves. So now really you will have one for the tax officer. I mean, that seems to be this. And of course for companies you will have under Indian, that is under Ind AS, which they are now talking about implementing. You will have under IFRS if they issue foreign securities, plus a third set which is, I think it's just trying to make life more difficult, frankly speaking. This is something I think which needs to be strongly resisted. TDS, a few amendments. You have, under for life insurance policy, under section 10D, proceeds of a life insurance policy amounts received under life insurance policy are exempt from tax, except for certain exceptions, and those exceptions are a keyban insurance policy, a policy which is issued between April 2003 and March 2012, if the sum insured, if the premium in any particular year exceeds 20% of the sum assured, and policies issued after 31st March 2012 if the premium in any year exceeds 10% of the sum assured. This, of course, these exceptions do not apply in case of death. If amount is paid on death, then it's exempt in any case on maturity. Now the amendment is that TDS is taxable on such amounts which are not exempt under section 1010D, where the aggregate of such amounts paid by an insurance company during year exceed 1 lakh rupees. So where it is 1 lakh or more, there will be TDS at 2%. Now you'll say that 2% people will regard this as a cost and would not have a problem. They'll still not show it this income, etc. But what you need to remember is 206AA would apply. If there is no PAN, 20% rate would apply. If there is a PAN, obviously the department would have that information through the ARs, etc. They would get that information. So therefore that's something which I think. Then the others, there are some amendments which are made which are regularize certain things which have been happening practically. Correction statements, today TDS statements you file, you find a mistake in that some PAN is mentioned wrong, some address is mentioned wrong, or some name is mentioned wrong. You file a TDS correction statement. You've been doing it for how many years? 3 years, 4 years? Well, let me tell you, the law did not provide for it, but yes, practically people are doing it. Now the law is providing for it. Similarly, TDS surveys. Now TDS surveys have been going on for I think so many years they've been going on. Practically, TDS surveys were going on and people thought that yes, this is as part of normal survey, one could do it. But now the law is amended to provide for TDS surveys under section 133A, and the law is now clearly says that they cannot impound documents or records or make an inventory of cash, stock or valuable articles or things during the course of a TDS survey. So those restrictions have been placed, fortunately. But see the way things are happening. Signing of an income tax return. The law provides for signing of an income tax return. Now what are you doing? You are filing an income tax return online, that is not signed, or it is digitally signed. Then what are you doing? You're downloading the ITRV. If it is not digitally signed, you're downloading ITRV. That ITRV you're signing, so it's a verification which you're signing and then filing that. You're not filing your return with a signature. So practically you've been doing this for how many, 7-8 years. Now they've realized that there's a problem, and therefore now they've signed the term is replaced with verified under section 139. But that's the way things are working today, that practically they try to work out things and then put it in the law after many years. That's the unfortunate thing. Then there is one more amendment as that for in relation to TDS, a person can be treated as an assessee in default for non-deduction of TDS or short deduction of TDS, where the TDS statements have been filed within a period of 2 years from the end of the financial year in which the TDS statement was filed. If the TDS statement is not filed, it is 6 years from the end of that financial year. Now they say that in case of reassessment, we can go back up to 6 years from the end of the relevant assessment year. So therefore, effectively, we have 7 years from the end of the financial year. So even TDS, we want it for 7 years, and therefore for all, whether you file your TDS statement or not, the time limit is now being enhanced to 7 years. Now that is the way. Now of course, this does not amend, this applies only to tax deductible source from a resident. For that, you can be treated as an assessee in default in this situation. What happens in the case of tax deductible at source from a non-resident? Would there be a reasonable period? There's no time limit prescribed, or would there be, can they do it for at any point of time? I would believe that a reasonable limit would have to be understood, and possibly it would be either a period of 4 years or this limit of 7 years would apply even in those cases. So far as penalties are concerned, again another amendment which regularizes things which have already been happening. NEFT RTGS is there for how many years now? I mean, I think all of us are used to that, So people have been repaying loans, etc., by NEFT RTGS, or accepting loans by NEFT RTGS, or even by foreign, SWIFT transfers. For foreign loans coming, it's always been by SWIFT transfers, and that foreign electronic transfers have been in vogue for almost now 15-20 years. But now the CBDT realizes that account pay check does not include such transfers, so therefore they say that electronic clearing system through bank account is also now. But I think this is on the returns front. Sorry, there's one more amendment which is there, and mutual funds, venture capital funds, and securitization trusts, they are also now required to file income tax returns. Of course, we already have that Bombay High Court decision in the case of Malad Jain Yuvak Mandal, where the Bombay High Court took a view that even if the income is exempt, you need to file the return, because how will the assessing officer otherwise know whether the income is really exempt or not? Business trusts also the category of which we will be coming to, and that is also compulsory to file returns. There is one amendment on penalty under section 276 SD. Now, penalty under section 276 SD is leviable for willful failure to produce accounts and documents under section 142(1) or to respond to direction under section 142(a), which is for a special audit. Currently, what is the penalty? It says either 1 year rigorous imprisonment or a penalty of 4 to 10 rupees per day of default. Either one of the two. Now the amendment is rigorous imprisonment of at least 1 year and a penalty, and no limit for the penalty. Now this is the way the amendment has this one, and which I think again places too much power in the hands of the assessing officers. It's something which could be used as a threatening tool. That's something, because 1 year rigorous imprisonment would be, the prosecution would be along with penalty. That's the whole problem. So far as attachment of property under section 281B is concerned, during pendency of assessment or reassessment proceedings, the assessing officer has the power to attach any property belonging to the assessee for the protection of interests of the revenue. And the procedure is laid down in the second schedule to the Income Tax Act. Existing time limit for which it can be attached is for a period of 6 months, which can be extended by a period of 2 years with the approval of the commissioner. Now the amendment is that it can be extended up to a period of 2 years, or by a period of 2 years, or till 60 days after completion of assessment, whichever is later. So that, if there is any liability found on assessment, they can recover that. That's the. Then on the AIR returns front, there is one amendment. The whole section has been replaced. Instead of AIR, now you have statement of financial transaction or reportable account. So earlier the AIR was only in respect of financial transactions. Now reportable accounts are also added to that, and the name is now a mouthful. Instead of AIR, it will be SFTRA, I suppose. Now prescribed financial institutions are also added under this, which was in addition to the list which was already there of stockbrokers, registrar, etc. all that. Besides that, now there is a provision which is added that if any inaccuracy is discovered by that financial institution in this the prescribed reporting financial institution in this report, the statement which is filed, within 10 days it has to correct that and file a corrected statement. If it does not, there is a penalty of rupees 50,000 for doing that, for not doing that. There is also a provision now for prescribing what is the due diligence to be carried out for identification of any reportable account. So therefore, what will happen is possibly they will ask banks, etc., to report certain types of accounts, certain transactions, certain types of transactions, etc. That is something which possibly AIR may come in. For instance, cash accounts where cash deposits are there, they may ask them for those details, etc. That is something which possibly may come. Then coming to the last item of business trusts. So far as business trusts are concerned, there are two types of business trusts which are envisaged over here. One is real estate investment trust, and the second, which is called REITs in short, and the second is infrastructure investment trust called InvITs. Last year, SEBI had circulated a discussion paper in June 2013 along with the draft regulation on REITs. Because REITs are quite popular worldwide. In fact, they invest in house property which is either earning a rent or which is being constructed, and various investors put in money, pool together money, buying units of that, and that income is distributed amongst the investors. That's the way it works worldwide. In December 2013, SEBI had circulated a discussion paper, draft discussion paper on InvITs. But what had happened is in the meanwhile, there has been a lot of litigation in respect of other types of trusts, which is private equity funds, venture capital funds, and securitization trusts, etc. All this litigation has been happening because all these are structured as trusts. Now, as you know, in a trust, typically what happens is it's either the trust who pays the tax or it's the beneficiary who pays the tax. The unit holders are the beneficiaries. Now, what has been happening is because of the tax targets and all that, to meet the tax targets, they found that in a situation where the beneficiaries have paid the tax at the full rate and they have given confirmation that they have paid the taxes, they have tried to tax it at a trust level. So there are a large number of matters which are stuck at the tribunal, I think, on this aspect. Wherever the trusts have paid the tax, they have tried to tax the beneficiaries. So either way, whatever you do, the department has been trying to levy tax, and this has created problems, and therefore, a lot of people have been saying that there has to be some sort of clarity on this. So SEBI also, therefore, they said that the REITs and infrastructure investment trusts will not take off unless there's tax clarity, and therefore they did not do anything further until the budget came in. Now the budget has fortunately brought in some amount of clarity, and what they've done is, ideally what would have been the best thing, that you have an absolute pass-through structure. So whatever is the income will be taxed proportionately in the hands of the investors, and accordingly. But no, that's not the way they've done. What they've done is they've divided the income of this business trust into two categories. One is interest income from the SPVs in which controlling interest is held by this business trust, and other income. So far as this interest income is concerned, that interest income is taxable in the hands of the unit holders. So what you have, what is the structure? The structure is you have a sponsor. The sponsor creates a trust. The trustee is an independent entity who holds these assets in trust. The unit holders, money is raised from the unit holders and units are issued to the unit holders. That money is used for investing in assets, real estate, in shares of companies holding real estate or constructing real estate, or infrastructure company, SPVs carry on. Now SEBI also envisages that you could hold real estate assets directly. The trust could hold real estate assets directly, or even infrastructure assets could be held directly. That's the way SEBI envisages under the regulations. Now, so therefore what happens is that there is also the sponsor can exchange his shareholding in that SPV for units of this infrastructure, of this REIT or the business trust. Now, so what they've said is the SPVs are all companies. So if you receive any interest from those companies, that interest will not be taxed at the REIT level or the business trust level. It will be taxed in the hands of the unit holders. So the proportionate income will be worked out and the statement will be given to the unit holder as well as filed with the income tax department. So far as the remaining income is concerned, that income will have to be considered in the hands of the REIT or the business trust rather. If it is long-term capital gains on sale of shares of that SPV, obviously it will be taxed at under section 112, and then the rate as we saw is 20%. If it is short-term capital gains, the rate will be 30% plus. If it is in the nature of any other dividend income, so dividend income received from the SPV. Now dividend distribution tax will be paid by the SPVs, so therefore there will be no taxability in the hands of the REIT or the infrastructure investment trust, and similarly when it is distributed to the investors there will be no tax because that has been considered for taxation in the hands of the REIT, of the business trust. Now when the interest income is paid by the distributed by the business trust to the unit holders, there the TDS would apply, 10% TDS from payments to residents, 5% in the case of payments to non-residents. Now these units are to be listed on stock exchange, units of REIT as well as the InvITs, both have to be listed on stock exchanges, and therefore the sale by the unit holder will be subject to securities transaction tax, and therefore long-term capital gains on sale of these listed units by the unit holder on the stock exchange would be exempt. But however, if the unit holder is a corporate entity, it would be liable to MAT, because for MAT purposes, as you know, 1038 exemption is not to be considered. Short-term capital gains earned by the investor on sale on the stock exchange, 15% 111A would apply. Section 111A would apply. Now there is one interesting aspect is that when the sponsor transfers the shares of the SPV in exchange for units of the business trust, at that point of time there is no capital gains tax payable. There is an exemption which is granted under Section 47, but when the sponsor sells the units, at that point of time the sponsor does not get the benefit of exemption under Section 1038 nor the concessional rate of tax under Section 111A. The period of holding is considered from the date on which the shares were acquired, not the date on which the shares were exchanged for units. Similarly, the cost is that of the cost of the shares and not the market value of the shares at the time of transfer for the units. So therefore, effectively, the tax is payable at the ultimate time of sale. So that is the concept of this business trust which has come in. I think a few points. There are certain announcements which the finance minister has made which are not included in the finance bill. One is of course that the section 911, the retrospective amendment, there is no change in the law, but a high level committee will be set up and no new demand will be raised without the approval of the CBDT. I think one would have to wait and see how this works out, because there is still a lack of clarity, because what is the percentage, what is substantial holding, etc. All that is a question mark. Authority for advance rulings being extended to residents, additional benches of the AAR. Transfer pricing today, only 1 year data. Tribunals have taken the view that it's only 1 year data which can be taken. So they're saying you'll be permitted to use multiple year data, and interquartile range will be permitted to be used. So therefore, but these are amendments I think which possibly may come in when the finance bill is moved for passing. That seems to be the intention, because these are amendments which possibly at last minute the finance minister has thought about, and therefore they're there in the finance minister's speech and not in the, well, I think I've completed my time limit. Thank you all for a very patient hearing.
Thank you, Gautam. One thing I have to say, Gautam has made us understand what this finance bill is, and I have to change my view, which I had 2 days back. So 2 days back we were considering, I had the same view as all those who are not present here, that this bill doesn't have anything which we have to learn anything more or to understand, because it is simple. There are no complexities. It may be the intention of the new government that it has to be made simple, and as Gautam said, and others also mentioned, that they did not get sufficient time to really make it simple. But as Gautam has explained these provisions, he has made us quite clear as to each of the provision, all the aspects. And we have found that there are a number of consequences which are unjust, and because of the trust which we have in this new government and the shortage of time, we use the word unintended consequences. Well, whatever he has narrated, explained, will be of lot of benefit to the chamber, WIRC and BCA for making representation to the government. And it is at that point of time they will have to really demonstrate that their intentions were really in a way to make the thing simple, not to have any unintended consequences, which let us believe that it is so. Because 2 days back even the organizers were considering whether we have to hold this seminar or not to hold. I was also of the same view. I mentioned to them, look here, the bill is so simple and short. One Chetan is sufficient to take care of everyone, and for me and Gautam you send the memento to home. They said that will not do. Though the memento is free, subject to terms and conditions. So you have to speak something. Well, I think there is something to speak, something to understand, something to apply our mind, and also express our views. So Gautam has done his job properly. We are waiting for the tea break, if I'm not wrong. And after tea break, we will have something more to understand from Chetan, and if time permits, and if there is something left out, subject to their terms and conditions, I will have to speak something. Well, I think now I have to hand over the mic to Chetan for the break and the further proceedings.
We'll be now breaking for tea and refreshments. I request all of you to complete as early as we can within next 20-25 minutes, because a very interesting session is now following on various provisions which are having adverse effects, and there have been many such provisions in recent past for last 2-3 years. Chetan Bhai has made a brilliant exposition on that, and we are all awaiting that. So let us break for 15-20 minutes and reassemble as early as we can. Thank you.